Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion today, coming to you from Montgomery, Alabama. We're here to discuss the rise in voter suppression. Voter suppression is something that we have seen on the rise across this country, especially since the 2020 elections. We got to figure out what we can do to kind of turn back that tide. We'd made such progress and now it's all kind of sliding away from us. So I'm joined today by three experts in this field who are really the boots on the ground in Alabama working with this. I've got Jatan Bosby Gilchrist, who is the executive director of the Alabama ACLU. I've got Bernard Simelton, who I've known for a long, long time, president of the Alabama NAACP, and of course, Kathy Jones, president of the League of Women Voters here in Alabama. So as part of the work that the Center for American Progress has been doing in Alabama over the last week to highlight racial justice and inequality issues, I've also had the honor of interviewing Mr. Fred Gray, attorney in Tuskegee, Alabama, one of the greats of the state of Alabama. And I interviewed him about the legacy of the civil rights movement and the critical moment we face in this nation as we sit here today. Many times in this country's history, the right to vote for millions of Americans is again being suppressed. It's being suppressed with a coordinated and targeted effort to suppress voting rights for Black and brown Americans. It's something we see every day. So a focus of my conversation with Mr. Gray was on the legacy of the civil rights movement, the history of the racist history of the U.S. Senate filibuster, something I saw, not the racist part, but I saw how the U.S. Senate filibuster can be abused. But that history to block civil rights and voting rights legislation throughout our American history, including the civil rights movement, is something that I think everyone needs to be talking about. You are experts on what's happening today in Alabama, a state that's kind of near and dear to all of our hearts, and in many ways has defined what the right to vote looks like. It seems we are always ground zero for voting rights and what that has meant to just generations of Americans. So I'd like to open the discussion by giving each of you a couple of minutes to just talk about the work you're doing and talk about what you're seeing in Alabama and what you and your counterparts are seeing across this country with regard to voting rights and the voter suppression that we're seeing overall. Justine, I'll go with you first.
Thank you so much, Senator. It's great to be here. The question particularly, what are the challenges that we're seeing? And I think it is very prevalent. So the ACLU of Alabama works in three ways. We work in the state legislature, we work in community, and we work in the ways that people know us best for, is setting precedent as it relates to litigation in this country. When we look at the arc and the history of voting rights, particularly with the inception of the ACLU in 1965, it is prevalent. I think that when we talk about how voting rights and suppression, as well as subversion, which is essentially saying, hey, we don't believe that this is right. We don't believe the voters have selected the individuals that they have named, and we're seeing that with particular state officials and agencies. That is the challenge. When you have a win like Milligan, and then the very first bill that the state legislature introduces is Senate Bill 1 that was just signed by the governor last week that criminalizes absentee voting. It is indicative that the progress that we have, there are always steps to really roll back those particular rights. And that is the work that the ACLU is focused on, of course, in coalition with so many of our partners at the grassroots level, as well as the League of Women Voters and the NAACP. And so that is how we are looking and understanding the arc of voting rights in this state.
We're going to talk about a couple of those things in a little bit more detail. Bernard?
Yes, well, I certainly appreciate this opportunity to be here. The NAACP has has for many years fight and continues to fight for equality in terms of civil rights, in terms of employment rights, and that includes everything from a livable wage, not just improving the minimum wage, but a livable wage in the state of Alabama and across this nation. in terms of voting rights, the NAACP, of course, we were a plaintiff in the Milligan case, and we worked very hard to ensure that the important parts of that case was really brought to the court's attention. And what is really devastating is when the state of Alabama, when the court had ordered them to draw a new map, and the state did not follow the federal court's order. And we can understand them maybe not following, but when they boldly said that we didn't feel that we had to.
And he intentionally
Intentionally did not follow the court's order in drawing a map that would include a majority black district. And so we have a lot of work to do in educating our legislators, those who are for us, as well as those who are not against us. We have to get out and educate them as to why this is so important. It's the right to vote. And when we think of voting rights, we think of Alabama. You look at the Shelby case and the Voting Rights Act of '65. All that came out of Alabama. And this is the mecca of voting rights in the state of Alabama. And the NAACP, along with other partners, League of Women Voters and ACLU and so many other partners, we're going to do everything we can to ensure that individual rights are protected and that they have the right to vote. And Jatan mentioned the SB 1, that's a solution that's looking for a problem because, absentee voting, we have people in our community, in our church, in nursing home that are not able to get to the polls to vote. And they depend on organizations like the NAACP to help them get their absentee ballot and, apply for it and then get the application. And so, that's certainly a blow to our work here in the state of Alabama.
All right. Kathy, what's going on with the League of Women Voters and what you're seeing?
One of the things that we realize is that a lot of people are not ready to vote. They need to be thinking about when elections are and what the issues are and also who the candidates are. So one of the things that we really strive to do is to educate people about the issues that are affecting them and their family and how voting can make a difference. And that's been a big focus for us, and working with other organizations to basically highlight and uplift some of these critical issues and how turning out to vote makes such a big difference. We are also helping through direct services, getting people registered to vote, making sure that they have everything they need, that they have if they don't have an ID, we find a way to get it for them. If they are disenfranchised, we help do the research through ALACORT and complete any paperwork like the certificate of eligibility to register to vote, work with them, and also through other organizations if they need help in people that they're working with. Then we provide that service. We've also started a project called the Alabama Channel, which we believe is just really desperately needed by Alabama to help bring transparency to what's happening in Montgomery, because you can get a real education watching the discussions and just the level of discourse that's happening in the committee rooms and the chambers. And we feel like that's providing information that people need to be able to couch and gather their arguments. And also every year when you go back, you can see what they did last year and the fact they keep bringing back these bad bills. We need to see what's happening and why it's, how we can combat the bad things that are happening in Alabama, and also just to help highlight the good things that are happening. The other part is we do have an advocacy arm that's actually analyzing bills to understand the impacts and try to raise the alarm when we see things happening that we feel like people need to know could affect them.
Yeah. Raising that awareness, I just want to make a comment. Raising that awareness, you would think in today's world of social media would be really easy. But because we have no hometown newspapers, because we have mainstream media that has just gone down, it's tough getting people to really focus on those issues and what's going on. just a few weeks ago, a lot of voting rights activists and others gathered not too far from here in Selma to commemorate the 59th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the march to Montgomery, and of course the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But I think obviously listening to the three of you, you would agree that we're really still in this fight today. We've started to backslide, and especially in light of the wave of restricting voting laws. But I'll tell you, one of the things that I see when I travel around the country and talk to people here in Alabama, they just don't recognize it. They just don't see. They see that the Voting Rights Act was passed. They see it's easy to register to vote, and they equate voter suppression simply with poll tax and tests that were given, those kind of things. And they don't see voter suppression in the sense of making it difficult to get to the polls. So I assume you're both would all agree we're still kind of at a critical moment. But I'd like to, for each of you, to just what do you say to Alabamians? What do you say to Americans who think it's not really a problem out there? It's not an issue for these communities. Everybody can get to the polls very easily. Mr. Tom?
Yeah, I think that what's important is to look at the socioeconomic issues within our state. So a white family, you have a median income of about $62,000. And with a Black family, it is a median income of about $36,000. So when we look at access holistically, it has a lot to do with our economic status. And so when we are limited in transportation, when we are limited in the things and our basic needs, that is also an indicator and how we are engaged and excited and motivated to want to vote. And I would also remind Alabamians, just because we holistically have a right does not mean it's always being exercised. And when you have that right, people are always trying to roll it back. Mm-hmm. And then also to understand, we have to meet people where they are. So not just in presidential elections, but voting for your school board, voting for your council person that is going to impact your basic needs, whether it is schooling, your community centers, how much your light bill and water bill is, clean water for your community. And so I think that that's important as we are having these conversations on, yes, access and suppression, but how are we meeting people where they are to really engage them and ignite them to get to the polls? And I think that's an important aspect.
Elections make a difference.
Yes, they do.
They make a difference. I'm going to skip over to Menard and go to you, Kathy. What do you say to folks out there? You're on the front lines of this too all the time.
Well, when you look at what's happening in the legislature here in Alabama, ever since the 2020 elections, there has just been just a deluge of bills that are attempting to fix problems that don't exist in Alabama. And many of those in the first year, 2021, actually died on the vine. A couple of them did not. In the middle of a pandemic, we've had bans on curbside voting. We've never had curbside voting. We were trying to have it during the pandemic in order to make voting safe, but that was, it wasn't enough that the Secretary of State denied our appeal for that, for safe voting, but they had to actually pass legislation to prevent people who are disabled that need to vote curbside now have no right to vote curbside. Just this past year, we've had Wes Allen and his office has eliminated.
Wes Allen is the Secretary of State of Alabama.
Has eliminated the phone app for voter registration and being able to check your polling places, which is a real hardship for people who rely on their phones to be able to do the business that they need to do. If they need to register to vote, we use it all the time when we go to schools.
Or even to see if their polling place has moved, which this state has also been kind of famous for doing at the last minute.
That's right. And then as a part of a campaign promise to pull us out of ERIC, which was done within the first week of coming into office, the Secretary of State pulled us out of ERIC, which took a decade or more to make functional and accurate, created a system that's not unproven. And just this week, there was an article in a local newspaper, online newspaper, where he said he's removed 109,000 people from the voter rolls. There's no transparency in who those people were, whether or not it was legitimate or not. It's part of his job to maintain voter rolls, but we have no transparency. The system is not proven. It's, as far as I know, he doesn't have MOUs set up with all the different states. So what basis did he use for that? But there is a lot of other examples of legislation that's being passed that's targeting people, trying to marginalize and divide us. And so I would say that to me is evidence.
Bernard, want you to go to that, but I also want to ask it a little bit different way for you. Particularly because both of you mentioned Senate Bill 1, which they call the Ballot Harvesting Law, which is criminalizes people helping others do absentee ballots, all in the name of fighting voter fraud. Okay, maybe I'm wrong, but the only voter fraud that I've seen really any evidence of in Alabama was a former Republican legislator who was convicted of voter fraud and removed from office. That's basically it. But that seems to be what's going on around here. The other thing I would mention in turnout, we've seen Alabama is historically in the bottom half of voter turnout. We've done a pretty good job of registering voters, but I can tell you from the statistics, about 22 or 23% of registered voters in Alabama have never cast a ballot. So that kind of gets back to the question of engagement. And how do you convince people that it's important to vote? How do you get folks to understand that their vote is being threatened right now, and the only way to save it is to exercise it?
Well, that's a very good question, and a question that the NAACP and other organizations, we baffle with. We talk about how do we get more people engaged, how do we educate people, and certainly through social media. But I think one of the things that we need to do is kind of take in the 2008 election when President Obama was elected, he really attracted and resonated with younger folks. And social media is one way, but that doesn't fully explain just putting things on social media. Yeah, it may say, well, get out to vote, but we've got to institute an education process where people will understand that if they don't go to the polls, they are not blocking people at the doors from coming to register. They are not literacy tests. They don't do that anymore. But it's these subtle things that are really affecting our ability to get people out to vote, and they just don't understand. I talk to a lot of young voters who, and we try to say, Dr. King and our parents and grandparents fought for the right to vote. Why would you not want to vote? And that just does not resonate with people, especially our young folks. And so, we've got to come up with different methods, and certainly one of those methods is through social media, in which we must continuously put that information out there. You can't just put it out there one time. And during the elections, there's a lot of propaganda that's out there that is discouraging people from voting. That and we have to help them sort through what is factual and what is propaganda. And I'm not talking about just propaganda within the United States. I'm talking about from foreign entities that are interfering in our election. And so, the NAACP, we do voter registration, motivation, and education. And then on election day, we help people get to the polls to vote.
I want to move to another subject, but I do want to say that one of the problems that I saw in some of my elections was people just say, it just doesn't make a difference. My candidate's not going to win or whatever. And I think we also have to kind of convince people your vote is your voice, and you're standing up and you're making a statement. And the more statements that can be made, the more people like our Secretary of State and our legislature, as gerrymandered as it is, have got to take notice. But they don't take notice with silence. and a vote is voice. So I do want to move over to the redistricting matter. You both mentioned the Allen versus Milligan case is a huge Supreme Court win last year when federal courts in Birmingham, ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court, or at least kind of upheld. It's still under, that case is still going on. People forget that case is still going on. But the fact is we got a new congressional district. A congressional district that is not majority minority, but it is competitive. It is one that I think realistically we should win, but we got to get people out to vote. So can you kind of walk through the decision of what that might mean for representation in Alabama for those whose voices may not have been heard except through one member of Congress and for a brief moment, one U.S. Senator? Jatan?
Yes, absolutely. I really want to pull us back to 2020. And when we talk about the Milligan decision, we've got to go back to the census of 2020.
Yep.
So in 2020, we have a census. And the expectation was that we were actually going to see a decline in population in the state of Alabama. And we saw an increase of nearly 500,000 individuals, primarily communities of color. And then we looked at the congressional seats that we had in the state, 7 congressional seats, but only one of them was considered competitive or a majority Black district, and that is Congressional District 7, where Representative Terry Sewell represents us. And what this did was it provides the legislature an opportunity to reapportion the state based on this new information from the census. And so the state legislature went into a special session to redraw these lines, and they essentially redrew the lines and they were unconstitutional. And that is how we got to that federal court in Birmingham. And then the state, they appealed that. And the state federal court said, hey, these are unconstitutional, and it is the obligation of the legislature, of our lawmakers, to redraw the lines to ensure they are representative. When the state appealed that went to the Supreme Court. And as you said, the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's decision. And then that map went back to the state legislature for another special session. And they, again, did not redraw the lines. And so ultimately, our new district was redrawn by an individual, by a special master throughout this process. And so I think that is important when we talk about representation and how our lawmakers have an obligation to the people. And so the development of Congressional District 2 is monumental for the state of Alabama, but also I think really sets this precedent that the state oftentimes has to be forced to do certain things. This also goes into the pre-clearance measure and Shelby. And so we have a long history of that, but it also informs us of the power of the voice of the individuals. All of the plaintiffs in the Milligan case are folks who are invested in the work of civic engagement. They are activists. They are individuals who have been a part of movement work for some time. And that has been part of one of the most exciting aspects of the Milligan case, including President Stuyvesant, who was also in the Shelby decision. But I think that we had to come back and really look at the broader issue to see how we got there.
You know, we'll come right back. I want to piggyback on that and let Kathy answer that. But I also want to make a point that this new district is not a sure thing. I mean, it's going to take a lot of work from a lot of people in getting boots on the ground to get folks out there to vote and understand the significance that you're talking about. Is that what you guys are doing too, Kathy?
Yes. We've been looking at the data coming out of the most recent primary election, and we knew that the district had been drawn with less than 50% minorities, Black African American population. And when you looked at what the turnout was, which was not good, it was 17% overall across Congressional District 2. It was still basically only 161 vote difference. But the good news here is that people actually have a chance. There is an opportunity here for African Americans to elect a candidate of their choice. And the way that I think this is really going to make a difference is, for one thing, to bring hope to people that they can have their voices heard. at the national level, which is going to flow down in so many ways to ensuring that communities that are facing environmental catastrophes, they've got, education systems, medical, they need additional health care. There's so many things that they could benefit from by having someone that actually is paying attention to their needs rather than being basically they've been divided up so many different ways that no one was really watching what they needed.
You wanted to add something? And if you can, you mentioned the Shelby County versus Holder case. Talk about that just a second and this trajectory that we've seen here in Alabama a little bit.
Yeah, I think Shelby is such a significant decision, and I know President Singleton, you know all too well as a plaintiff in that case. So what Shelby did was essentially eliminate the pre-clearance aspect section of the Voting Rights Act. And so when we go to 1965 of the VRA, 1965 Voting Rights Act essentially allowed us the ability for disenfranchised communities, particularly Black individuals, to be able to vote. And what it did was it authorized a certain segment of states. So those states included Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, I believe, Arizona, South Carolina, Hawaii, and
the old Confederacy.
Yes, the old Confederacy. And it was on the basis of, hey, these states have a history of voter discrimination, and we need to watch these states closely. And it required those states to go through the federal government to make decisions on polling places, any particular voting laws, and that particular aspect of the Voting Rights Act, that Section 4 and 5, was reauthorized several times, in the 70s a couple of times, in the 80s as recently as 2006. And what Shelby did essentially was said, hey, we're actually in a post-racial society. And that decision rolled back so many of those necessary protections that we are seeing take precedent now. So when we talk about voter suppression taxes such as voter ID laws, in 2015, we saw the closing of DMVs across the Black Belt. Nearly 30 DMVs were closed. And that was the direct line for people to get their voter ID laws to be able to go to the polls. Now, Shelby has essentially limited how we are able to say, hey, this is an issue, because people cannot say and flag that prior to the issue or the discriminatory act is already enacted before folks and individuals can say, hey, this is a problem. And so that is the importance of what Shelby did in rolling back and weakening the Voting Rights Act. And we are still seeing the repercussions of that decision today, writ large in Alabama, across the Deep South, and quite honestly, across the country.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about the engaging the youth vote. And I haven't looked at this for 2022. I think the votes in Alabama were a little bit skewed in 2022 because Democrats really didn't have a very strong slate of candidates like a lot of the other states did. But I'll go back to 2020 in my race. Out of the registered voters in Alabama, 72% of registered voters over the age of 65 voted. 72%. When it comes to voters ages 18 to 30, which is close to the same numbers as voters older, it's that bell curve that we all know about. Not quite, but it's about the same. Only 42% or 41%. It's a huge swing between that. Now, I think nationwide voters, younger voters came out better in 2022. But I think we still got an issue here in Alabama and a number of states where younger voters are just not getting engaged. We talked about it a minute ago, Bernard, but from Kathy, is the League of Women Voters specifically trying to reach those younger voters out there to stress the significance, to try to get that vote up?
Absolutely. When you look over the last 10 years, Alabama's voter turnout for young people has declined a lot. There's a study out of the Circle out of Tufts University that shows that it's one of the top, we've had one of the highest rates of drop-off in younger voters turning out in the country. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but One of the reasons is we don't have automatic voter registration. Students are, getting out of high school without being registered to vote. They're also feeling like, their vote may not count. And that's what we keep hearing is, my vote doesn't count. And it's hard to counter that when you can't, you need to have a good discussion with them. But what we're finding is that they get more excited when they talk to each other. And that's one of the things that we've really been focusing on, working with several organizations, including NAACP and ACLU and other organizations, is to find opportunities to bring young people together and let them talk about why they think civic engagement is important and why they should vote. And beyond voting, how do they make change in this country and what change would they like to see? And so I think that kind of dialogue, what we really would like to see happen is to have young people leading a student-led, a young voter-led civic engagement movement that will basically, they'll bring along their peers to show up and vote. And that's what we're supporting. And, trying to crack that nut, because we can't tell them what they care about. They're the ones that need to be telling us and everyone else what they care about and getting involved.
I hope that we can get more involvement in schools. Sometimes it's hard to think in it out. We look at the next election, but there are kids today that can't get their driver's license yet that will be voting in 2026. And we need to start talking to those. Let's move a little bit more, and I appreciate everybody's comments on that. But one of the issues that I've seen over the years in Alabama and a number of the states is the disenfranchisement of folks who have been convicted of crimes, particularly certain felonies. Now, Alabama, to their credit, the legislature did make some changes a few years ago that gave folks the ability to get rights restored, which, quite frankly, I think is a misnomer. If it was never supposed to have been taken away, it shouldn't have to be restored. It should be automatic, but that's a whole different story. But Jatan, I'd like for you to first talk a little bit about the punitive nature of that, of not allowing folks that once they've been incarcerated, get out, serve their time, pay their debt, they're still never allowed to be to vote, which seems to me just automatically excluding them forever and making them second-class citizens. Talk about that a little bit and how important. Talk about the history a little bit and where that's been and how that can change.
I think the history of disenfranchisement is important to name. And so when we are talking about, you mentioned the state, in a few years back, maybe about 5 or more years ago, the state passed the moral turpitude law, really defining different classes of felonies in which people, because there's this assumption that if you are formerly incarcerated or have a felony conviction, that you cannot vote, and that is absolutely not true. And there are measures that the state put in place to make that clear. However, that doesn't always happen effectively across each different county, right? And so that is an opportunity for us to make sure that we are connecting with individuals and ensuring that they know what their rights are. And we are seeing some great individuals doing that work. We have the League of Women Voters that does work with voter restoration, organizations like the Ordinary People Society, and several others that really do the work of restoring the right to vote. But I think that this goes back to the history of disenfranchisement. And I have to go back to 1944, yes, which is All Right v. Smith. And the importance of this is that really allowed, it essentially said that, hey, you cannot block anyone from voting based on race. So this is 1944. So we have to look back. That's 20 years before the VRA. And essentially what that did is something that we're seeing similarly now is that now states are saying, well, actually, no, we're gonna enact poll taxes. We're gonna impact grandfather clauses and literacy tests. And so we saw the rolling back, and we see that now. We see the same things now. And so this history of disenfranchisement, they say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so when you see an opportunity for access to the ballot and it is extended, we also see in the same sense areas in which those particular protections or opportunities are rolled back by state legislatures.
Bernard, I want to follow up a little bit on this about disenfranchisement for folks who have been incarcerated, because one of the things that we also see are the over-policing, mass incarceration. There seems to be a connection here about that. Do you see that in your community?
Yes, absolutely. And part of the concern with disenfranchisement of previously incarcerated folks is that when they get out, they have fines that they have to pay, restitution. And when you have a job that you can only, make so much on, and you have a decision to make whether I pay for my restitution and fines, you're going to feed your family first. And so what we'd like to see is that more legislation passed that would, do away with, these fines, make it automatic. Once you complete your sentencing, you have your votes fully restored so that you can become a productive member of society and vote. And if that were to happen, we see a significant increase in the number of voters, especially for those who have been disenfranchised. And there are organizations out there are trying to help raise money to pay these fines, but there's not enough money out there, and organizations don't have enough money to pay all these fines. And so I think with that's a way in which we can help those voters return to society in a more expedient manner. And I've forgotten the other portion of your question.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I wanted to add on to this. I think we also need to keep in mind that individuals to receive or to for their votes to fully be restored, depending on the type of felony conviction an individual may have, they have to receive a full pardon. And we do not quite, we have a parole board that is now getting to a space where they are providing more pardons, but those have been, we've seen some real racial disparities in that. And disparities, yes, amongst individuals who are receiving, who are being paroled, but primarily a lot of individuals who cannot receive a full pardon because for various reasons. The process is opaque. There are not a lot of avenues in which you know how to go about this process and be successful. And I think that is an aspect of this work, because all of it is intersectional. So we're talking about voting. We're also talking about criminal legal reform and mass incarceration. And that is a major issue in the state. And so really thinking through how we can make things more accessible so folks can get the pardons that they need to have the full access to the ballot that they well deserve.
Yeah, they're state of Alabama in particular, they want you to have a voter ID, and then they'll shut down the DMVs. They say, sure, we'll let you vote if you get your rights restored. Just go through this incredibly difficult and a process that's just going to take forever to do. It's just, these are all, people need to connect these dots a little bit to make sure they understand.
Can I add just one piece to that? If you look at those who are incarcerated, around 53% of the prison population is African American. And that's compared to, around 10-15% of, whites. And so that in itself is a disenfranchisement, because when you have that many percentage of the prison population that is African American, it's over policing, people being stopped for things like tail lights out, that leads to, some kind of confrontation, leading to, possible, assault on a police officer, leading to jail time. And while it may not be a moral turpitude of a fine, but it leads to that person being disenfranchised and not able to vote for a period of time. And so I think that's what leads to over-policing in our communities. In a lot of our communities, police officers have a larger presence there. Again, I'm not anti-police at all, but when you have police that's just following you around for no reason, I mean, that's within itself is a form of harassment, and that we need to it needs to stop.
And we could do another whole panel discussion on that. Um, Kathy, I do want to give you a kind of a broad stroke on this issue. What would democracy and government in Alabama look like if we could have more universal ability to give folks who have lost their right to vote, give them that right back?
Well, so first of all, we believe that democracy works better when everyone is able to vote. And when you look at the history of the moral turpitude, the taking people's rights away for felonies, this has a racist background, racist origin. And if we could eliminate people equating voting rights to the fact that you had made a bad decision or were caught up in the court system, then you're going to, people are going to be able to get their life back in order. There's studies that show that recidivism is reduced if you can get people back into voting and feeling like they have a voice in their community. The more people are engaged, the more they bring their families into the voting process, then, Alabama will become a better place. We will be able to heal more if we have everybody participating and being able to vote. The one thing I will say is that it would be a big economic change for a lot of communities because of the fact that, when you take people out of the court system, when they're no longer basically propping up the, right now these legal financial obligations that are being charged to people who are disenfranchised, they are basically propping up the operation of so many communities across the state. That's going to be something that is going to make it tough. But I know, people being able to get their lives back in order, they'll have to figure it out.
So we've been going a long time, but I cannot leave this conversation without talking about federal legislation over the last couple of 3 years, the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and of course that arcane rule called the Senate filibuster. Yeah, the Center for American Progress is releasing a new report looking at the really racist and oppressive history of the Senate filibuster. Didn't have to be that way, but that's how it ended up. And it's been used repeatedly over the last century to block anti-lynching bills, to obstruct the passage of critical pieces of civil and voting rights legislation, including the Civil and Voting Rights Act of the 1960s, just at the heart and the height of the civil rights movement. That legacy continues today as the Senate filibuster is being used to block critical pieces of legislation, including the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. John, you talked about this a little bit, and I want to talk first about the Voting Rights Act and its history, and over the years, how it was reauthorized by near unanimous votes in the Senate and the House. Even Alabama senators were voting to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. That has changed, especially since the Shelby County decision. What do you think's changed in the national dialogue around voting rights that the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and other legislation just gets blocked and stymied? What's changed and where are we?
So I think this is important to say. The Voting Rights Act and voting rights should not be a partisan issue. It should not be a partisan issue, but because politics has become so polarized, it has put us in a space in which we see access by individuals who have been systemically, historically silenced or disenfranchised as a way or a talking point to say we are losing something, a scarcity mindset. And that is what has been so unfortunate in seeing the stymieing of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because essentially what this country is always known to be when it comes to democracy are people's preferences shape democracy. It shapes our decisions and how we show up and the things that we need for our communities. And so it is unfortunate to see this, but the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would essentially allow us a level of equitability across the board from, as well as the Freedom to Vote Act, making voting a holiday, ensuring early voting. Alabama is one of 3 states without early voting, including Mississippi and New Hampshire. There is a level of access and equitability that helps everyone, irrespective of race, gender, socioeconomic status. And that's what the focus should be as we are thinking through the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and how that will strengthen our democracy in this country.
Kathy, before we talk about the filibuster, which will be our last subject, I want to talk about the Freedom to Vote Act. That was the last piece of legislation. There was others before that, and then there were some compromises made. And the Freedom to Vote Act did a number of things, but it got blocked in the Senate. I think it passed the House. Let's focus on that if you could. What are some of the most meaningful ways that just the Freedom to Vote Act would have to improving access to voting in Alabama, and especially in communities of color?
When you look at the way the Alabama is organized from the elections, the way they manage their voter rolls, each county maintains their own voter rolls, and if people are moving around, which they do, there's a lot of people that move from county to county, especially in these urban communities that move in and out of the big cities. Having automatic voter registration where your registration is updated as you move, they have that information. If that were done, it would make life a lot easier for people when they go in to vote, that they have not had to go take proactive action to be able to update their voter registration. Also, with young people right now, they have to opt in to the voting process, which, when you look at a young person, a citizen who has the right to vote, and yet they have to opt in to be able to vote for their very first time. And if you had automatic voter registration where they were ready to vote on their 18th birthday, then that would give them at least the first tool that they need to be able to go vote. The other thing that's really critical is to add early voting for Alabama. When you listen to the legislature talk about absentee voting being our most insecure process, and that there needs to be more constraints, make it harder, literally make it harder, you realize that the only answer is early voting. That is how people are going to be able to vote and make their vote when it's convenient for them, in a secure setting where they can vote just like they would on election day, but they do it when they've got an opportunity to go to the polls, not just on that one day when the election is happening from 7 in the morning till 7 at night, where they may be off out of county working.
Or the weather may be bad.
Or the weather may be bad.
Any number of things that happen. I've always thought that the Freedom to Vote Act would have done so much to establish those minimum standards that give people other opportunities, and we could get more people actually voting. We have seen that, and then we've seen increases, but again, we still lag behind. Yeah. We still lag behind in Alabama. We're behind the curve.
And making it where you have to restore someone's voting rights after they finish their sentence, then you also avoid this debate about whether somebody deserves to vote or not. They have it, and it's their right, and they can move on with their life.
Bernard, I want to talk about, real brief, the Senate filibuster. We've seen it time and time again throughout history. We've seen it block the civil rights legislation until finally it just got wore down. Today's rules are a lot different. I can attest from the fact I've worked in the U.S. Senate at a time when the filibuster was rarely used. Today, every vote requires a cloture vote, which was the term used to end debate. When there was filibusters in the past, they would take a cloture vote. Now there is a cloture vote on everything, and it requires 60 votes. So let's talk a little bit about that. How do you think we should reflect on the filibuster's history as an institutional tool used to prevent progress and prolong oppressions in this country?
And again, that's a very good question. But I think the Senate needs to change its rules as to what majorities take, or what percentage of voters it takes to, you know, to stop the filibuster. And I mean, if things are getting so bad now, it's, you know, it's too partisan. We have to get back to what is good for the people, and you have these national organization who is spearheading and sponsoring legislation, and those who want to support it feel that they can't because they don't want to go against the party. And so, you know, if you have a filibuster rule and reduce the number of votes it takes to override, you know, bring closure to it, then you will be able to move legislation, I think, further along. But until that happens, you know, that's what, you know, people are going to use to prevent legislation from being moved to the floor to vote. Because I think, you know, if you can get it to the floor to vote, some people would support it. But, you know, because one person wants to filibuster, it's just stuck there.
Yeah, it seems to me that there is one of our major political parties these days who really don't want to compete for votes. They'd rather just assume that certain people are going to not vote their way, and they are just want to try to block them, and they can do that through the filibuster. Anything anybody else want to add on the filibuster before we head out? Or I think we all can agree there needs to be some serious reform about
I don't want to say anything
program.
about filibuster, but I want to go back to how we can increase voter turnout. You know, in larger cities, we've had Sold to the Polls, you know, and talk and discussion about making voting a holiday. And I think with those two things, you know, making voting elections a holiday, you would increase the turnout, because a lot of people of color, you know, they're working jobs where they, you know, can't take off, you know, unless they run the risk of getting fired or something like that, you know. And so making voting a holiday, I think you'll see the increase in voter turnout overall. And
the Freedom to Vote Act would have done that as well.
Right. And yes.
All right, we're kind of at the end of this. And I want to tell you how much we appreciate the Center for American Progress. Really appreciate your time here this morning. I want to give each of you a chance. Maybe there was something that we missed that you just want to, that you feel an outburst of emotion that you want to say or whatever. But let's just wrap up with whatever you want to do. And I'm going to start the opposite way, and I'll go with you, Kathy.
Well, in 2024, it's more critical than ever that people show up and vote. Voter turnout is key. We need to work hard to preserve the democracy that we all deserve, and Alabama deserves it as much as anyone. And right now we have an opportunity to we have the chance to have Congressional District 2 be competitive. For the first time, people in that district have an opportunity to have representation and have their voices heard. And I'm excited, and we need to make sure everyone across the state shows up and votes.
Yeah, we must get out and vote to preserve our democracy. And I know that's kind of becoming a cliche, but that is a fact. If you look at what some of the politicians are talking about and what they are going to do on their first day in office, our democracy as we know it will be destroyed if we do not get out and take voting seriously and take responsibility, and not only your vote, but your neighbors and your neighbors vote, and making sure that they get out and vote. You know, and we're nonpartisan. NAACP is nonpartisan. We won't tell you to vote for, but we think you're smart enough that if someone is attacking you then you're going to do everything you can to prevent that attack and overturn that. And the one way we can do that is through our vote. Our democracy is at stake, and we must fight, like hell to overturn it.
I want to say that I remain inspired by this next generation. We've talked about engagement and challenges there, but a few weeks ago, I went to the State House, and being presented or going through committee was Senate Bill 129, which is an anti-DEI bill, the defunding of diversity, equity, and inclusion offices across the state, which ultimately the governor signed last week. But before that, we saw an outpouring of college students from across this state show up at the State House. They lined the halls of that State House. So much so that at a committee meeting, the legislators had to sneak out the back because they didn't want to engage those students. And they spoke truth to power on the steps of that State House after they showed up. And I think that is an indicator for me about progress in the state. And I think it continues to show up in how engaged we are in understanding what's going on in that State House that ultimately impacts things that happen to us every day. And so I'm engaged and excited about this next generation because they are understanding the political process. They are understanding the importance of democracy that is more than just showing up to the polls on voting day. And that is equally as important, but it's also important to understand how laws are made and to ensure that we are holding our elected officials accountable. And so as we go into this election season in 2024, I really look at the long haul. I'm thinking about 26 and 28 and 2030. And we have to understand this is long haul work. We think about the Montgomery bus boycott. We're here in Montgomery, and the history of that started in 1955. Voting Rights Act wasn't signed until 1965 with the Selma to Montgomery March. That's a 10-year scope. So we have to really think about the importance of the long game. And I'm going to end with a quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, but we have to remember that we bend it. And so collectively as coalitions, we are bending it each and every day.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here today. And thanks to the Center for American Progress for putting us all together. Let me close with a thought to kind of paraphrase. It was actually Ronald Reagan who said in his first inaugural as governor of California, talking about freedom, talking about democracy, that freedom is a very fragile thing. It is not something that is guaranteed, and it's something that we have to work for every day, every year. And those in history who have lost their freedom have never gotten it back. And we need to remember, as Bernard said, democracy is on the ballot. So thank you all.